Now, I will tell you some shocking facts about life in America. Before us lies an endless ocean of grass stretching to the horizon, the Great Plains of the 19th century. This is a world with no trees for hundreds of miles. For pioneers arriving from the forested eastern states, it was a shock. Where could they find material for a house? And most importantly, how could they stay warm during the penetrating winter when blizzards buried everything for weeks? Warmth was synonymous with life, but it seemed like fuel had disappeared from the face of the earth. Watch the video to the end and you'll learn why ordinary cow dung was valued more than gold on the prairies, and how women created haycats to cook dinner for their families. I will reveal the most closely guarded survival secret on the plains, and it's not weapons. For a settler on the Great Plains, fire was not just a source of heat, it was a psychological anchor. In a world made of endless sky and waving grass, a small flame in the fireplace was the only center of the universe. It was proof that civilization still existed. This fire was the only source of light on moonless nights when coyotes howled outside. Sod houses, built from layers of earth, had very small windows or none at all. Only the fire in the hearth chased away the oppressive darkness and gave a sense of safety. Without it, not only physical blindness, but mental blindness would occur. Fire was the heart of the home, the place where food was cooked. It transformed raw supplies, flour, water, salted meat, into hot meals that sustained strength. The sound of boiling water in a kettle or the smell of baking bread were symbols of stability. This was what separated the family from the chaotic hunger. Around the hearth, the whole family gathered after a long day. Men repaired harnesses, women mended clothes. It was the only warm place in the house, the center of social interaction. The fire brought people together, giving them a reason to converse in the closed space. The fear of losing the fire was one of the strongest fears of a pioneer. A dead hearth meant not just cold, it meant raw food, pitch black darkness, and oppressive loneliness. Every family knew that their survival directly depended on the ability to maintain that flame. This dependency shaped a special mindset. The search for fuel became a daily primary task. It mostly fell on women and defined their entire routine. Every found twig, every dry stem was valued like gold. Unlike the eastern states where firewood was abundant, here fuel was scarce. This taught an incredible level of frugality. Not a crumb of coal, not a single ember went to waste. Every calorie of heat counted. This constant fuel hunger was the background stress that never left the settlers. They could survive droughts, locust invasions, but a winter without fire was as good as a death sentence. It was an invisible battle fought every day. This psychological aspect is often overlooked when talking about the conquest of the West. But it was the fire in the hearth that was the citadel they defended. It was the boundary between order and primal chaos, between home and the wild prairie. That's why methods of acquiring and preserving fire became the highest form of survival art. Have you ever thought about how much modern man depends on central heating? What would you do if it suddenly disappeared? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next explorations. Are you ready to learn the truth about how fire was lit before matches were invented? By the early 19th century, matches existed, but on the frontier, they were an expensive and unreliable commodity. They easily got wet on the road, broke, and ran out quickly. That's why every pioneer and trapper relied on the time-tested method of flint and steel. This kit was an essential part of the gear, as important as a knife or rifle. The steel was a small strip of hardened steel, often shaped like a C or an oval. It was easy to hold in the hand and lasted for years. The second component was flint. It had to be a very hard stone with sharp edges capable of striking sparks from steel. Suitable stones were not everywhere, so a good piece of flint was carefully guarded and carried around. But a spark on its own is useless. It needs something to ignite. For this, they used tinder. The ideal tinder was charred cloth, or char cloth. It was prepared in advance by slowly burning pieces of cotton or linen in a closed metal box. This charred material had a unique property. It didn't burn but smoldered. Even the weakest spark that landed on it would instantly ignite it. After that, the smoldering piece of cloth had to be blown into a flame. For blowing, they used dry, easily ignitable material. It could be bird fluff, dried grass, tree bark, or special fungi. The smoldering tinder was wrapped in this material and gently blown until the fire appeared. The entire process required skill and dry materials. In rain or strong wind, it was incredibly difficult to light a fire this way. The hands had to be dry and the movements precise. One wrong strike could ruin the flint, and wet tinder would become useless. That's why the tinder box, the special box for storing flint, steel, and tinder, was kept in the driest place. It was often a sealed metal or wooden box. Losing or damaging the tinder box was a serious problem. Mountain hunters, trappers, were true masters of this craft. They could strike a spark and create fire in the harshest conditions. For them, it was a basic skill, one that directly impacted their survival in the wilderness. But even the most skilled master with flint and steel was powerless if they had nothing to burn. And what if I told you that the most common and reliable type of fuel on the Great Plains didn't need to be chopped? Are you ready to find out which prairie secret shocked every settler at first? What I'm about to tell you was forbidden to discuss in polite society, but it saved thousands of lives. When the first settlers arrived on the Great Plains, they were overwhelmed with despair. The complete lack of trees meant no firewood. But soon they noticed that the previous inhabitants of these places, bison, had left behind a solution to the problem. I'm talking about dried bison dung, which pioneers delicately called chips, or prairie coal. In the dry climate of the plains, it quickly dried out in the sun, becoming a light, fibrous, and completely odorless material. For people used to firewood stoves, this idea seemed wild at first. However, necessity quickly overcame disgust. Settlers discovered that these chips were excellent fuel. They easily caught fire, gave off an even and very hot flame. What was especially important was that they burned almost without smoke. This property was invaluable for sod houses with their primitive chimneys. Smoke from wet grass or willow branches filled the house with acrid fumes. Prairie coal, however, allowed cooking and warming without choking on smoke. Collecting this fuel became an important part of daily life. Families would go to the prairie with wagons and collect chips in large bags. It was hard work that took a lot of time. They only collected perfectly dried, old chips that were as light as cork. The collected fuel was stacked in large, neat piles next to the house. These piles were as common as firewood stacks in the East. The size of such a stack indicated the frugality of the owners and their preparedness for the winter. In winter, when the ground was covered with snow, collection stopped. The family was completely dependent on the supplies accumulated during the summer. The consumption was huge, as the chips burned fairly quickly, even though they gave off a lot of heat. Sometimes when supplies ran low, settlers had to literally dig for fuel under the snow. This was a desperate measure, but it allowed them to make it through until spring. Later, when bison disappeared, cow dung took their place, becoming just as valuable a resource. This seemingly unappealing detail of daily life was, in fact, the key to understanding the settlement of the plains. Without this free and abundant fuel, settling vast territories would have been simply impossible. People learned to use what the land gave them in abundance. The story of prairie coal is a tribute to human adaptability. It teaches us that the solution to a problem often lies right under our feet, even if it seems unattractive. If you like this unique fact about frontier life, please give this video a like. What if everything you've been taught about fuel was actually outdated? On the frontier, the rules were different. When bison chips ran out and winter had not yet retreated, settlers turned to what can be called desperation fuel, and its main form was ordinary grass. Of course, dry grass burns in an instant, giving almost no heat, but pioneers found a way around it. They learned to twist long prairie grass into very dense bundles called cats or briquettes. This process was labor-intensive. The grass or hay was soaked in water and then tightly twisted by hand or with the help of special primitive tools. Sometimes the bundle was coated with clay to make it burn slower. The resulting briquettes were dried in the sun and became as hard as wood. This fuel burned much longer than regular grass, giving enough heat to boil water or bake bread. But it produced a lot of smoke and ash. The chimneys of sod houses were constantly clogged with soot from burning grass. This created a risk of fire and filled the house with fumes. But settlers often had no choice. Another important fuel, especially in areas where corn was grown, was corn cobs. After the grains were eaten or sent for grinding, dry cobs were left in vast quantities. They were perfect fuel for cast iron stoves. Corn cobs gave off a very strong, fast, and clean heat. They were great for quick cooking. Many housewives preferred them to any other fuel for baking because they allowed a quick temperature rise in the oven. The problem with cobs was that they burned almost instantly. To keep the fire going, they had to be continuously fed into the stove. This meant someone had to be constantly tending the fire. In desert areas of the Southwest, everything that could burn was used. Mesquite tree roots, dry yucca stems, tumbleweed. People gathered literally any dry organic material they could find. This constant search for fuel was exhausting. It showed how fragile life on the edge of civilization was. In the next chapter, we will see how they built their hearths and how effective they were at burning this scarce fuel. How difficult do you think it was to build a fireplace without bricks and stones?
It's not much without proper stone, but this packed mud should hold the heat.
It will do fine, John. It will keep us warm this winter.
The heart of any pioneer dwelling on the plains was the hearth. But in a place where there were no stones or trees, building a fireplace was a real engineering challenge. The foundation of the house was layers of sod, and the hearth was no exception. The fireplace was usually placed against one of the walls of the sod house. It was built from the same materials as the house itself. The walls of the hearth were made of dense sod layers, sometimes plastered with a thick layer of clay or silt brought from the riverbank. This clay, as it dried, formed a hard crust that protected the sod from direct fire. However, this protection was unreliable. The clay cracked from the heat and crumbled over time, requiring constant repair and updating. The chimney was the most complicated and dangerous part of the structure. It was often made by weaving willow twigs into a wide basket and coating it with a thick layer of clay. This structure was known as cat and clay. Sometimes a hollow tree trunk was used for the chimney if one could be found. But more often, it was simply a square tube made of the same sod, rising above the roof. This chimney had very poor draft. Because of the poor draft and wide hearth, most of the heat went straight up the chimney. These fireplaces were extremely inefficient. They only warmed a small area right in front of the fire, while water in the corners of the room could freeze. In addition, they were a constant source of problems. During heavy rain, the clay chimney would soften and dirty water would flow directly into the hearth, extinguishing the fire. This was a real disaster in the middle of winter. Sometimes small animals could enter the house through the wide chimney, but the main danger was soot. Primitive fuels, especially twisted grass, gave off a tremendous amount of soot, which settled on the chimney walls. This soot easily caught fire, leading to house fires. Although the sod house itself couldn't catch fire since it was made of earth, the burning soot could ignite the wooden rafters of the roof. This was a constant threat. Despite all the flaws, this primitive hearth was the center of life. Food was cooked in heavy cast iron pots, people warmed themselves, and wet clothes were dried. It was the symbol of home, albeit smoky and inefficient. Want to know the secret that truly changed life on the prairies? It wasn't a new culture or new weapons. It was the humble cast iron stove. Its arrival on the frontier revolutionized everyday life. Primitive sod and clay fireplaces were terribly inefficient. The cast iron stove, however, was the height of engineering at the time. It was compact, relatively safe, and most importantly, incredibly economical. Unlike an open hearth, the stove was a closed system. This allowed for control of air intake using special dampers. The fire burned more slowly and fuel was used much more efficiently. The iron, when heated, began to radiate heat in all directions. The stove heated the entire room, not just the space in front of it. This completely changed the quality of life during cold winters. To heat such a stove, much less fuel was required. The same bison chips or corn cobs burned longer in the stove and provided more useful heat. This reduced the daily workload of collecting fuel. Stoves were multifunctional. The flat top could be used to cook several dishes in different pots at once. Many models had built-in ovens, allowing for regular baking of bread and pies. The thin metal chimney pipe was much more effective than the wide clay pipe. It created good draft, and all the smoke went out of the house. The air inside became cleaner, and the walls and ceiling no longer collected soot. Of course, the stove had its downsides. It was expensive. Settlers often spent their last savings to buy it. Transporting the heavy cast iron stove in a wagon across the prairie was another ordeal. It had to be installed properly to prevent fires. The metal pipe passing through the sod or wooden roof required careful insulation, but all these difficulties were worth it for the comfort it provided. The cast iron stove became a symbol of prosperity and civilization. It freed women from the constant struggle with smoke and soot. In the next chapter, we'll learn about methods that allowed them not to light the fire every morning. Do you think it's possible to keep the fire alive all night? Lighting a fire with flint and steel was no easy task. That's why the main goal of pioneers was not to light a fire, but to keep it going. Losing the fire, especially in winter, was like a small catastrophe. There was a whole science to banking the fire for the night. This process required care and experience. The goal was for the coals to keep smoldering under a layer of insulation without going out or reigniting. The most common insulator was ash. In the evening, after cooking was done, the housewife would gather the largest and hottest coals into the center of the hearth. Then she would carefully cover them with a thick layer of ash from the same stove. Ash is an excellent heat insulator. It blocked oxygen from reaching the coals, preventing them from burning completely. At the same time, it kept their internal heat. The coals entered a slow, barely noticeable smolder. The thickness of the ash layer was critically important. Too thin, and the coals would burn out by midnight. Too thick, and they would suffocate and go out. Every housewife knew her hearth and would find the perfect balance. In the morning, the ritual was reversed. The woman would carefully rake the ash. If everything was done correctly, she would find a few bright red, smoldering coals in the center. While pioneers on the plains struggled for every joule of heat in their homes, mountain hunters had very different tasks. In the Rocky Mountains, firewood was available, but fire was not only a friend, but also a foe. The trapper's main task was not to stay warm, but to stay unseen. The trapper, or mountain man, would spend months alone in the wilderness. Any smoke could give away his position to hostile Indian tribes or competing fur companies. That's why their approach to fire was based on stealth. They never built large fires unless absolutely necessary. Their campfire was small, often no bigger than a hat. Its job was not to warm the camp, but to provide a way to cook food. The spot for the campfire was chosen with great care. An ideal spot was a small depression in the ground or a crack between rocks. This hid the flame from prying eyes and kept it from spreading. The choice of fuel was critically important. Trappers avoided pine and fir because they smoked and crackled, scattering sparks. They preferred dry willow or aspen branches. They burned evenly and produced very little smoke. Often, trappers cooked one meal a day at dusk. During twilight, the smoke was less visible against the darkening sky. After cooking, the fire was immediately and thoroughly extinguished. They never left the fire burning overnight. A nighttime fire was a beacon for anyone within a few miles. They slept wrapped in heavy bison hides, which held heat excellently. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the frontier had changed. Wagons were replaced by trains, and pioneers were replaced by new nomads. hobos, or wandering workers. Their life was tied to the railroads, and their fire-making methods were suited to that. Hobos lived in jungles, makeshift camps located near railroad junctions, usually near water sources. The central element of any jungle was the communal fire. It was a gathering place, kitchen, and news center. The fuel for this fire was different. Hobos didn't look for bison chips or dry grass. Their main source of fuel was the railroad itself. They collected coal that fell from the tenders of passing trains. Coal was excellent fuel. It burned for a long time and produced incredible heat. A few pieces of coal could keep the fire going for hours. This was the fuel of the industrial era, and it was obtained for free. Another source was old railroad ties. Soaked in creosote, they burned very hot and produced a lot of smoke. Although the smoke was harsh, for hobos, who didn't need to hide, it wasn't much of a problem. The hobo fire was primarily a kitchen fire. On it, they cooked the famous hobo stew in tin cans. Each person brought whatever they could find, a few potatoes, an onion, or a piece of meat. Finally, we moved to the southwest, to the scorched deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. Here live the Apaches, masters of survival in one of the harshest climates on the planet. Their attitude toward fire was driven not so much by the need for heat, but by the need for stealth and resource conservation. The Apaches rarely used fire for warmth. They were phenomenally resilient and adapted to the cold desert nights. A large warming fire was an indulgence they couldn't afford, as it would reveal their location. Fire was almost exclusively used for cooking, but even this fire was special. It was small, smokeless, and often hidden from view. For fuel, they used the dry roots and branches of desert plants, such as mesquite. This wood burns very hot and produces almost no smoke. They only collected completely dry, dead material. The Apaches' main culinary secret was not an open fire, but an oven pit. It was a genius technique using heat. They dug a pit, lined it with stones, and started a strong fire inside. When the stones were red hot, the coals were removed. Food, often agave hearts, was placed in the pit, wrapped in wet leaves and covered with dirt. The food cooked slowly for a day, using the heat stored in the stones. This method was perfect. It didn't require constant fire maintenance, produced no smoke, and was completely hidden. Essentially, it was an underground oven that worked on stored energy. We see that the history of fire on the American frontier is not one story, but many different ones. From the smoky hearth in the sod house, fueled by prairie coal, to the tiny smokeless fire of a trapper in the Rocky Mountains. From the communal pot in the hobo jungles to the underground oven of the Apaches. Each of these methods was a brilliant response to environmental challenges. Settlers, hunters, and nomads used their ingenuity to obtain warmth and hot food where there seemed to be no resources. They learned to value things that would otherwise have been overlooked. This story teaches us adaptability and inventiveness. It shows that even in the most hopeless situation, the human mind can find a way, using the simplest gifts of nature. Fire was and remains a symbol of life, and on the frontier, that life had to be fought for every day. What other topics from the history of the American frontier would you like to see on our channel? Perhaps you're interested in the construction of sod houses or methods of finding water in the desert? Share your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new episodes.